Among the world's 10 most unequal countries, 7 are located in Africa. Across the continent, the richest 10% receive 54% of total income. Bottom 50 receive only 9%. That's according to figures from 2019. Africa is therefore an integral part of the global discussion about inequality. And to talk about it today, my guests on this episode of Grande Ligne are Ande David and Rawan Yasser, both researchers at the French Development Agency, and Murray Lightbrand from the University of Cape Town, where he's the director of the African Center of Excellence for Inequality Research. Together, they are the lead authors of Inequalities in Sub-Saharan Africa, Multidimensional Perspectives, and Future Challenges. The report was published in Africa Development Forum, a book series jointly published by the World Bank Group and the French Development Agency. Welcome to all three to this episode of Grande Ligne, the podcast on development research.
Grande Ligne, le podcast de la recherche sur le développement.
Your book identifies a number of markers of inequality, and two of those are education and health. And you specifically talk about the way that these two drivers of inequalities shape labor market opportunities for people living on the continent. What are, in your mind, the most effective policy interventions that African government can implement to address disparities in those two areas of health and education and ensure that populations have better labor market outcomes? I'm turning to you first, Rawan Yasser.
So in our book, what we try to highlight is exactly this, that inequality is a policy choice. So we know that the level and quality of education can make a big difference in employment and earnings opportunity. But what we also find, and what is highlighted by the research, is that even for people with the same level of education and the same level of health can have different outcomes in terms of labor market outcomes based on their gender, location, or access to networks. So this is where education policies and health policies come in, but this is also where labor market policies come in. So in our policy chapter, for example, we identify what we call inside-the-box policies. So these are the conventional policy-making decisions that change incomes directly. So among these, we find the labor market policies. For example, the most widely used tool in this is the minimum wage. Minimum wage is applied in almost 40 African countries. However, it's alone, this tool is not sufficient. So this is where we find other employment incentives training, public employment programs that enable vulnerable individuals to participate in the labor market. In this type of conventional inside-the-box policies, we also find the social expenditure policies. And among them, we have the cash transfers, which is a very popular tool in African countries and can be a very crucial tool to ensure universal social protection. But what is crucial is to harmonize labor market policies and social protection policies to ensure that we reduce inequalities by giving access to labor market policies. So you'll notice that education and health are absent in these frameworks, and this is what we try to highlight by what we call outside-the-box policies that act more on the structural and systemic side of inequalities. And this is where I turn to Murray to talk about outside-the-box policies.
Yes. So this framework is due to a very famous economist called Anthony Atkinson that is very useful because it's written in the context of the global north. And it's just acknowledging that we actually have a lot of information about income and wealth inequalities and even the policies that are directed at overcoming those. But the way that inequalities perpetuate themselves, as we were discussing just now in a multidimensional way, makes some of these income policies very, very blunt to confront what's perpetuating poverty and inequality over time. So as Rawan was saying, education and health are often regarded as inequalities of opportunity that long precedes before you get into the labor market and before income inequalities pick you up. But it greatly impacts on what you bring into the labor market. In that sense, it's very much part of conventional policy making, but it's not conceptualized in the inside the box income and tax policies to confront inequality. Where this is very consequential, actually, for confronting inequalities in Africa, is that these inequalities of opportunity are really the platform. We need equality of opportunity as a platform for African citizens to actually be productive, to flourish, to do well in the labor market, but also to be the best citizens that they can be. And so it's a very sort of a profound structural issue. And it in not thinking about these education and health inequalities in that way, one loses a lot, because even, for example, the focus on provision of infrastructure in a country, which is often thought about as, okay, we need infrastructure to crowd in businesses to enable the economy to flourish. Well, you need infrastructure for people to get to schools and to have any real school choice, or to get to clinics too. And so this multidimensional nature of inequalities and how it intersects with education and health is a profound societal metric of how that society is doing in overcoming inequalities. And what our book really uncovers is most societies are really doing very badly at all of that, so that by the time people get into the labor market, there's great inequalities that economists then tend to say, okay, but these people just have different productivity. Yes, but what led to that productivity? What led to, you can almost endorse gender discrimination, for example, at that point, by the fact that you've got these systemic processes around education and health that go against females.
Speaking of gender, and I turn to you again, Rowan Yasser, gender-based inequalities are deeply rooted in African contexts and elsewhere, of course, but on the continent, they have significant consequences in terms of access to resources and to opportunities. Again, how can policymakers address those disparities, and how can they promote more inclusive forms of development across Africa?
So policies to address gender inequalities are usually given to education or labor market or health access. But the issue with gender inequalities is their intersectional nature. So other issues of ownership, social norms, and gender norms usually intersect with inequalities in education and labor market. So this intersectional aspect really needs to be taken into account in policy actions aiming at gender inequalities. So, for example, in education, while interventions mostly aim to reduce the gender gap enrollment in African countries, other initiatives to combat social and cultural norms are crucial. For example, teaching advocacy to girls, but also improving water, sanitation, and hygiene facilities, and providing scholarships to ensure increasing female enrollment. Another aspect where social norms can have an impact is occupational segregation, where we have female-dominated occupations that are usually paying lower wages and influencing the choice of field of study and choice of occupation for women. So policy intervention in that case can improve women's skills and educational attainment, but it can also create inclusive workplaces and mandatory paternity leaves to avoid discrimination at hiring and increasing hiring of women. Women's participation and choice of field is also limited by their unpaid care work, which is something that is usually not taken into account in national accounts. It reduces their time spent on income-generating activities, and it also reduces their income. So while this is directly the cause of gender norms, but legislations and laws can be a first step towards reducing this type of inequalities. Other initiatives such as public infrastructure can also reduce the burden on women and increase their opportunities in the labor market. We're also left with an issue of gender inequalities in access to resources and ownership of assets across Africa. So this could be land and housing ownership, but it can also be livestock, financial assets, and savings like access to bank accounts, etc. So once again, these inequalities intersect with other types of inequalities, with the gaps being larger in rural households and being larger in poorer areas. So we need to recognize how important these assets are for women's bargaining position and their position within the households and for their livelihood. So policy interventions through legal systems are crucial. Egalitarian legal regimes have been proven to increase women's property ownership, but also reforms to enhance financial inclusion can address the lower savings of women and their access to assets and therefore increase their income and their savings and enabling them to move out of informal and vulnerable employment into business and formal employment. Also, legislative reforms can increase women's inheritance rights and improve and increase their empowerment. And also reforms in the workplace like workplace protections, equal pay, etc., can increase women's empowerment and their access to labor market in the presence of the persistent social norms, but they can be a first step.
Another important phenomenon that is described as both a cause and a consequence of inequality in Africa is, of course, migration in all of its forms, rural to urban, but also across international borders. Anda David, could you elaborate on how migration patterns can impact inequalities, both at the household level and at the community level, and talk also perhaps about the policies that can be implemented?
International migration has a huge role to play in decreasing global inequality. So we've seen that whenever people migrate to another country, they become much richer, they have much more opportunities. So on the whole, international migration will decrease inequality amongst everyone on the globe. But it also has impacts at the country level. And these can be direct impacts through, for instance, the remittances that immigrants will be sending to their origin households. And these remittances always will reduce poverty through different channels. So they can increase consumption, they can increase food security, they can allow for entrepreneurship, they can allow also for an increase in opportunities such as education. Very often remittances pay for education, for school fees. So they will always have a positive impact on the revenues or the consumption of the origin households. What the literature shows is that as migration becomes a more global phenomenon, or even it becomes more intense at a country level, migration costs will decrease, especially through networks, and the poorest or more vulnerable households will be able to also send migrants. And for instance, Margolis and his co-authors, they show that for the case of Algeria, migration actually decreases inequality. The impact of these remittances on inequality will also depend on the cost and the cost of sending remittances. And this is where, for instance, policy can play a significant role. And there are several international agreements, or at least tries to lower the cost of sending remittances, because this can have a huge impact in terms of the effect that the remittances can have on household well-being and on the poorest, therefore being able to reduce inequality. A bit more complex, and there are fewer studies on this, but remittances can also have a distinct impact on inequality depending on the migrant that left and whether these remittances can compensate for the loss of the potential wages or earnings that the migrant could have brought in the origin household. Now, we have also more indirect impacts of migration that will mostly be through labor market. And here we see very different impacts between origin and destination countries. This will depend on whether the migration is high-skilled or low-skilled and how it is complementary to the local labor force. So what we saw in some countries is that migrants could actually take the more low-skilled jobs, therefore increasing the labor mobility of the nationals, of the local labor force, and allowing them to get higher earnings for for their participation in the labor market, therefore reducing inequalities amongst nationals. For internal migration, I will leave the floor to Rawan.
Yes, so Africa is also characterized by very rich flows of internal migration. This we observe with rural to urban migration, which are significant. So, once again, here inequality plays a role because the labor market income differentials and the rural urban wage gap are considered by the research as the main driver of internal migration. So, the prospect of higher income in urban areas, especially for the youth who face higher unemployment rates than other age groups, often see migration as their only chance of social mobility. And this is not only inequalities in terms of income, but also inequalities in access to electricity, paved roads, educational opportunities, health access, and technological development. And what we also see is that these internal flows are accelerated by climate change. We know that Sub-Saharan Africa is among the most impacted regions, and rural to urban migration has increased recently as a response to climate shocks. And this involuntary migration from rural to urban areas is expected to increase even more in the coming times with more climate shocks and droughts in Africa and the region.
Thank you. I want to end this episode with the, of course, increasingly central topic of climate change. Africa is disproportionately affected by climate change, as we know, and this exacerbates existing inequalities, as your book shows. What strategies, what actions, according to you, are needed to ensure that climate adaptation, that mitigation policies are equitable, and that they do not involuntarily further deepen existing inequalities? On to David.
So what we saw in the literature specific on Africa is the key role, for instance, for agriculture, not only because most of the impacts are actually around agriculture, so this poses quite a few challenges in terms of food security, but also in terms of disposable income and assets and income sources, but also because a significant proportion of the population in Africa is still dependent of the agricultural sector for their incomes. This means that interventions that have to do with the adaptive capacity of food production systems are especially important, and these interventions go from farmer training programs to enhance technological advancements, and they can have a catalytic impact in terms of adapting to climate change, whilst ensuring that the high vulnerabilities of the poorest are not even further worsened. We then have all the interventions that are in the social policy domain, such as adaptive social protection mechanisms, but also simply social protection and public employment programs. What we see very often is that either if we talk about adaptation per se, or maybe even more mitigation measures, such as those around the just transition, just energy transitions, people almost don't see from the start social protection as being one of the pillars of these interventions. And what we see, and we see it quite clearly in South Africa, for instance, is that social protection schemes and specifically public employment programs, for instance, can play a key role in ensuring that people are not left behind in a transition that is very often either driven by technology or that is being driven by the urgency of climate change. Access to credit can also improve resilience by allowing households to either change livelihoods or simply diversify their incomes. And I think a point of attention that we're trying to bring is that of the maladaptation, because it can redistribute vulnerabilities. And in order specifically to avoid the maladaptation, what is important is that policymakers understand with a lot of detail the local context and the local dynamics. Well, I mean,
Yeah, I'll just add to that point a little bit, and where it's in the spirit of our book to try and recognize the fact that people in all country contexts are active agents trying to do the best that they can in the world. And the book on the inequalities tries to spell out how the inequalities limit people's options. And this really becomes a very useful framework in looking at what's called adaptation, or sometimes even the adaptive capacity that people have to respond to climate change. And I think Anders spelled out very nicely how that's uneven, and it's incredibly useful part of the book, I think, to show that that when climate change responses are negotiated or nationally determined contributions are written down, the inequalities in how that's going to impact on people are often not considered. But what breathes life into that in terms of our strategy in the book, as Anders said, is to try and link that to people's abilities to progress. That's what social mobility means. And so this idea of adaptive capacity in the book, we've tried to ground it in, what are the possibilities that people have to actually make the adjustments that they want to make and know that they need to make. That's not the issue. Can they make it? And I think Under referred to the issue of land. That's where she started talking about her inputs. And if you think about land, one of the things we find in Africa, for example, is that these norms that Ruan was talking about earlier, in terms of actual abilities to make decisions about land, have extreme gender biases in it. Sometimes it's even legal, but often it's not formally legal. It's norms. And so, you're expecting adjustments from smallholder farmers who are often women. They aren't capacitated to make the adaptive response that they know that they need to make because of the way that the multidimensional inequalities are actually working in their society. And so they're very stifled in that regard. And one strong aspect of the book then is this focus on social mobility. And I think one of the best examples of why it's useful is in this issue of adaptation to climate change.
Thank you very much to all three, Anda David, Rawan Yasser, and Murray Lightbrand. I encourage every one of our listeners to read Inequalities in Sub-Saharan Africa, Multidimensional Perspectives and Future Challenges, the report that you published in Africa Development Forum, a series jointly published by the World Bank Group and the French Development Agency. Thank you for listening to this episode of Grande Ligne, the podcast on development research of the French Development Agency. All our titles are available in open access at editions.afd.fr. And for titles in the Africa Development Forum series, you can also access them through the Open Knowledge Repository of the World Bank Group. Today's episode was produced and edited by Eric Tauvin, and I am Etienne Chaya. Thank you.